Hello and welcome to this series on UMA integrations. So in this first couple of videos we're going to have a look at Will Hong's marvellous dynamic bone system. If you haven't seen it, basically it allows you to make things jiggle. So little example here, you can see the tail's using dynamic bone and so is the lady's chest area. So what we've got here is something it just adds a bit of life to your characters. Lots of other uses. We can use it to create hair that jiggles around, so like ponytails. We can use it on, say for example, if we had a sword hanging from our belt, we can make that jiggle around. So there's lots and lots of different reasons why you'd want to use this. So it costs very little. Pick it up. You won't regret it, trust me. So the way I'm going to approach this is the way that I've approached integrating almost everything. And that is to get UMA up and running and see if I can do what I want to do manually inside the editor. The reason being, if we can get something working in the editor, then we can get it working using code. So let's get an UMA up and running in our scene. So I'm just going to, let's have a look. Go into the Getting Started folder, put UMA DCS in there and avatar. Lovely. Let's change this to a female for obvious reasons, and let's go into the utility recipes. Now we could make use of this. We could turn our dynamic bone stuff into a utility recipe. We might have a look at that later, but for now I don't want this capsule collider. I just want my UMA to float in midair. Let's quickly run that and make sure everything's working. Yep, there we go. So before I go any further, let's give her some hair, and in fact let's change this default animation. So I'm just going to go down to the animator. I'm going to double click on locomotion, so I've actually found the animation that's running. I'm going to stop, and let's go into this animator. I'm going to copy the run and I'm going to paste it, and I'm going to set that as my default state. So if I run now, that's great. So that's going to give us a much better view of any jiggling bones that we create on this character. And finally, let's go into the contribution, female ponytail, and let's add that to our character. So open up the default wardrobe and pop that on there. Right, so when we run now, that's what we've got. Brilliant. Okay, that's a good starting point. So where do we go from here? Well, let's get our scene working again, and let's try and manually add dynamic bone to this character. And the way this works is, in its simplest form, you basically add a script to any bone you like, and it will make every other bone below it in the hierarchy wobble. Okay, so I'm going to use spine 1. That means that will make the neck, the shoulders, and everything else that's in there wobble around. Now initially on an UMA this can look quite ugly, because UMA has a lot of extra bones to allow characters to be modifiable, so we tend to get some rather spiky wobbling going on, but we can fix all of that, not a big issue. So our initial results will look awful. So on spine 1 I'm going to add the dynamic bone script. You can see just typing dyn brings that up, and we need to tell it which is the root bone. So we'll pull spine 1 into there so it references itself, and there we go, job done. Alright, maybe not. We are actually getting the effect we want, but there is a lot of other stuff going on here which we don't want. So I actually want to add some exclusions here. So anything I add to the exclusion list, for example the neck, means the neck and all the bones below it will no longer be affected. So if I drop that into here, you can see the face has stopped being so horrific. Let's do the same with the shoulders. That's the right shoulder and the left shoulder, and just for good measure let's do this spine 1 adjustment as well. Okay, so as you can see, we now have that effect working correctly. We've just proven that we can do that in the editor, and it was a fairly straightforward thing to do. So let's go and have a look at doing that in code. Now, before we go any further, I'm actually using a little utility script here. Let's just open that up. This is an extension to the transform class, which allows us to find deep child. And basically what that does, it hunts through a hierarchy and finds any named object in that hierarchy. It makes it really, really easy for us to find specific bones with a straightforward command. Now, I've seen this used in a lot of commercial assets on the asset store. So if you do use this and you start getting this asset already exists, just delete it. Somebody else has got it in their package. So either pause and copy that down, or I'll leave this in a paste bin link in the description for this video. But that is going to be really, really useful for all sorts of different things. Okay, so what do we need? Well, first of all, we need to create ourselves a script, which I'm going to call jiggle. Okay, so this is the script that is going to control our dynamic bone and actually do what we just did in the editor. To make this happen, I need to add some UMA stuff. So I'm going to create an UMA. What shall we have? We need a slot. So custom slot asset, and we'll call this jiggle slot. So because we're going to need to have an instance of this jiggle available to us to fiddle with the data on, we need this attached to a prefab. So let's create an empty game object. We'll call this jiggle prefab. Attach our script to it and bring that into our folder. There we go. So I can now delete that from the scene. So how is this going to work? Well, if you're used to UMA, which I hope you are if you're watching this, we're going to use a slot. Let's give this slot a name, and we'll call this jiggle slot. And again, let's camel case that. Make that look right. Okay, so the jiggle slot would normally have some geometry attached to it. We would create it using our UMA slot builder. However, I've just created it as a blank asset, so a little bit different there. And all this is going to do is, in the events, when this has been applied to a character, this slot, it will fire off the script on our prefab. So with that is really powerful. We can actually do anything to an UMA using a slot, or we can do anything with an UMA using a slot. So quite clever that, if you think about the power that gives us. Let's see what happens here. So I am first of all going to have a look at altering our jiggle script. So let's start by adding a reference to UMA, because we're going to be using that. So using UMA. There we go. And let's get rid of this junk here that we don't want. Make this human. There we are. Lovely. And let's stick some strings in here. So we'll first of all have a public string called jiggle bone. Why not? Or jiggle bone name. That looks good. And I tell you what, let's have a string instead of a sting. Lovely. Okay. Next we will have a public list of string, and we'll call this exceptions. Okay, so that's going to be our list of bones that we don't want to be affected. And I think that's all we'll need for now. So now we need to create a method to fire off whenever this slot is added to our UMA. So let's start by saying I want a public void, and what should we call this? Add jiggle. Good a name as any. What we will do, and one thing we can do with that event that's going to come from our slot, is we can actually send an UMA data. Now this is important because we need to tell this script which UMA is actually calling it. So this UMA data will allow us to identify the actual UMA that is requesting this to actually happen. So see how I can't type and talk at the same time. So we're actually going to say that is going to take in an UMA data, and then we'll use the right type of braces, and this is ready to rock. So first thing we need to do is find the actual root bone. We went through the hierarchy and decided on spine 1, didn't we? Well, I tell you what, let's just save this and fill out some of this data. So if I go into my prefab, you can see my jiggle bone, we wanted that to be spine 1, and the exceptions, there were 4, so I'm going to put in here neck, left shoulder, right shoulder, and spine 1 adjust. Okay, so we've got some data to work with now on our prefab. So in here, let's start actually using this. So let's create a transform called root bone. And that, let's find that. So this is where that UMA data is going to come in handy. I'm going to say UMA data, dot game object dot transform, and then I'm going to use that extension class find deep child. There it is, and I'm going to say that wants to be jiggle bone name. So that is going to find from our data here spine 1 and put that into the root bone. Okay, so now let's define a dynamic bone, and we'll call this jiggle bone. Okay, and just in case this has already been added, let's hunt for one that's already there. So we'll say it's going to be root bone dot get component dynamic bone. Yep. So if we've already got one on there, grab it. If not, so if jiggle bone is null, then we will create one. So we'll say jiggle bone equals root bone dot game object dot add component a new dynamic bone. So let's test this out. First thing we need to do is hook up our slot to actually call this actual method. So if we go into our jiggle slot here, open up the events and say when a character is completed, let's add something, and we'll say on that prefab I want you to go to the jiggle script, and can you see here this one's sending UMA datas? So we'll say add jiggle, and that should fire this script off. So we need a way to get this onto our character. Now I'm eventually going to add this to the base UMA, so this happens, or this will be added every time we create a human female. But for now we're going to make use of that utility slot here that we messed about with before. So I'm going to create really quickly, so this is just for testing, an UMA text recipe, and I'm going to call this jiggle test. Okay, so in this straightforward base recipe, this isn't a wardrobe recipe, it's a base recipe, so something that can be used on an actual race model. So we're going to go into the slots and we're going to add our jiggle slot. Now it's saying it's not indexed, so let's add that to the index. So this looks good. I think it looks good. Let's find out. So if we go to our avatar, let's put that recipe into here and run. Let's see what happens. Okay, so if we hunt through here, what that script should have done is on spine 1, it should have added our dynamic bone, and there we go. Nothing's been connected up yet, so we've got no root value, we've got no exclusions, but that script has worked. So you can see there immediately how a little bit of messing around with slots and scripts, we can add anything we like to an UMA. So let's carry on with our little script. So what we need to do next is add the root bone to our jiggle script. And this is actually the same bone that we've got our jiggle script on, so we already have a reference to it. So let's say jiggle bone, that thing, and we'll say root. It's m_root actually, and we'll say that is our root bone. So again, if we tried this, we should get that horrible effect we had before. There we go. So you can see step by step we're gradually getting there. All we need to do now is add the exclusions. Okay, so let's go back into here, and because this is a list and we need to supply a list to the jiggle bone script, let's create one. So we'll have a list of transforms. We'll call this exclusion list, and let's initialize it as a list of transforms, and then for each string, and we'll call this an exception in exceptions. So that's our list up here. Again, that's where is that? That's these fellas here, so it's coming from our exception list. So for each one of those, we want to add them to our exclusion list. So exclusion list dot add, and again, these are just strings, remember, so we're going to have to hunt for these, same way we did up here. So let's just copy that out. So we found the root bone with that one. Let's go in here, but instead of the jiggle bone name, we want the exception. Let's try spelling that the same. There we go. So that's simply going to go through all of the exceptions, all of this list, and add them to our new exclusion list as transforms rather than just names. Great. So finally, let's add them. So jiggle bone exclusions, and again you can see it's m.exclusions, and we're going to say that equals to our exclusion list. Brilliant. One thing that the documentation suggests is that we put a jiggle bone dot update parameters on the end of all of this. Now while we're setting these up, I don't think it matters, but one last thing we're going to do, that becomes really handy. So what we should have now is where we were in the editor. So if we run, there we go, we've got that nice motion, and we've excluded all of the bones that we don't want included in the simulation. Brilliant. So the one thing I don't like about this is using this as a utility script. That means it will always be applied, and it's not necessarily something that we want. For example, if you put an iron breastplate onto this character, you don't want that motion, you want it to stop, but you want it to return when you take that item of clothing off. So let's get this out of the utility script. I don't actually want to use it like that, and I'm going to add it to the character itself. So if we head into UMA and let's go into the core and human female, and let's find the recipe. So we want the base recipe here for the human female. There it is. And if we look in the slots and let's just collapse these, there's all of the slots that make up the base human female. Let's add our jiggle slot to that. There it is. So now if we look, we haven't got this utility recipe running anymore. Now whenever we create a human female, it'll receive that motion. So let's do an example of this breastplate. How do we make an item of clothing suppress that? Well, let's find something. I don't think there's anything iron in here, but I do think there is. Let's have a look. In contributions, we've got a tank top. So let's mess with this. If we put this onto our character, let's put this on to the default recipes here. If we drop that on, you can see the motion continues. Okay, I want to make this piece of clothing stop that motion. Very easy to do. First of all, let's add something more to our little jiggle script. We'll have another field in here. So let's have a new field in here. We'll have a public float, and we'll call this reduce effect. Good a name as any. And because what we're going to use goes from 0 to 1, let's just make this nice for the editor and put a range in here. So let's call this range 0, 1. Okay. So this slider here is going to suppress the effect. It's not going to remove the actual dynamic bone. It's just going to alter the intensity of the effect. So you could have an iron plate, which is going to stop it entirely, or maybe leather, which will suppress it mostly, but you'll still get some motion. And to make that work, we're just going to send something else over to our jiggle bone. So jiggle bone, and we're going to say we're going to alter the inert slider. You'll see that when we have another look at it. So it's m_inert, and we're going to apply the reduce effect value to that. Okay. So that's the code added, and what we should see if we look at our let's go down and look at our prefab. You can see now there is a reduce effect button on there, so this will allow us to suppress it entirely or not at all. So seeing as how this prefab here is the one that we're using to actually create the effect in the first place, we need a second prefab. So we're going to let's duplicate that one, Control D, and we'll call this. So we've got jiggle prefab that actually gives the effect. Let's call this jiggle prefab off. Okay, and this one's going to be exactly the same, sets the same things up, but I'm going to completely reduce the effect on this one. So we've got two different presets there, if you like. So how do we make an item of clothing that already exists actually apply one of these? Well, very easy. It's the same as we did with this slot. So if we have a look at our tank top, find the slot, go into the events, and again, where we had character completed, we will add our new prefab off and hook that up to this add jiggle component, and that should do it. So let's run again. There we are, part of the race, the jiggle component is there. If we then add this tank top, what you should see is the jiggle effect stops completely. And we can prove that by looking into the actual jiggle script, and you can see this inert slider has been moved to 1. I can obviously remove that and get things moving again. So if I take this item of clothing back off, the jiggling comes back. If I add it again, it stops. So that is a really handy way and a really easy way to add Will Hong's wonderful jiggle bone to a character. What I'm going to have a look at in the next couple of videos is actually doing something a bit more complicated. So we're going to make hairstyles that jiggle. Okay, so I hope you find that useful, and I will see you next time. And once again, I'd like to say a big thank you to my patrons for making this possible. If you would like to support me, feel free to click that link at the end of the video. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.